It's the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilbert coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. Last month, Bloomberg Businessweek published a report on the average returns on university endowments. According to the analysis, Harvard University's endowment averaged only 4.4% annually over the past decade. This was slightly below the national average of university endowments, which was 4.6%. In contrast, the best performing mutual funds average about 10%, over 10% over the past decade. So what is going on here? And why haven't Harvard's endowment fund managers been fired? Joining me to discuss this issue is Dean Baker. Dean is senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and is the author of the book Rigged: How Globalization and the Rules of the Modern Economy Were Structured to Make the Rich Richer. Welcome back, Dean.
Thanks for having me on.
So apparently Harvard not only did not fire its endowment managers, but actually paid them almost $250 million over the past decade, which amounts to about $1 million per manager per year. What is going on here? Why is a patently underperforming endowment paying its managers so much money?
Well, it is quite striking, and this is the norms of, this kind of super elite labor market, that it's basically a heads I win, tails you lose. So they have contracts, and again, I don't have access to their contracts, their specific contracts, but the general nature of these contracts are that they get paid large fees to begin with, and then when they do well, then they get way more than that. So they might start with $1 million a year, and then if they do well, they might get $2 million, $5 million, $10 million a year. If they end up doing poorly and cost the school money, they still get their million. So this is the sort of contract, all of us would love. We understand incentives when you do well, but then if you do poorly, as they did, you'd think there'd be a penalty. But no, they're still there. And just to be clear, because you made reference to the highest performing mutual funds, and of course you'd love to have those, but those are often hard to pick out. But a more neutral measure that was in that article is if you had simply an index of stocks, that would have outperformed Harvard's endowment over this 10-year period by an average of, I think it was 0.7 of a percentage point. Now, if that sounds trivial, their endowment's almost $40 billion. So 0.7 of a percentage point would buy you $280 million a year. That's money could be used for financial aid, for hiring more faculty, whatever it might be. That's a lot of money, even for Harvard.
So in an article that you recently wrote about this for Truthout, you also point out that the problem of the lack of relationship between performance and pay for top managers can be seen in many other places in the economy. And you mentioned pension fund managers and CEO pay as other examples. Tell us about these other instances and why does this actually end up happening in so many different places?
Well, pension funds, a very, very similar story. They're convinced that, they're hiring, everyone's the most brilliant person on earth, and, they're going to give them a deal as long as you don't disclose the terms of the contract. So you have a lot of pension funds that are paying out millions of dollars to private equity funds in management fees who are often losing them money, which is kind of incredible. In the case of CEOs, here too, you have a similar dynamic where the people who most immediately control CEO pay are the boards of directors, who largely owe their position as CEOs. So from the standpoint of the directors, it makes very little sense for a director ever to get up and go, hey, could we pay this person $5 million a year less? The average pay for these people is over $20 million a year at major companies. So can you pay them 15? Maybe you could pay them 10. No one ever asks that question. I've suggested that, and people think I'm joking. I go, isn't that their job? That's what they're supposed to represent, the shareholders. But the idea that they would actually look at the CEO and go, well, you really aren't worth that. And I'm just talking about what they do for the shareholders. I'm not talking about whether they're nice people and whether they're, doing good things for the environment. We'd like that, but I don't expect that because they're there to make a profit. So fine, do they do that? And we find that, CEOs are basically rewarded for luck. My favorite example here is the Exxon CEO, who happened to recently be our Secretary of State, Tillerson, made a fortune when oil prices went through the roof in the last decade. And as far as I know, he had nothing to do with that. But that's how they're paid. And it matters not just because, like we're jealous, it's not fair, this and that. If you envision a world where CEOs were paid like they were 4 decades ago, they got paid a lot even then. They got paid 2 or 3 million. That would have a huge impact on pay scales through the economy. Because when a CEO gets 20 million, the person next in line is getting 10 or 15. The people under them are getting 2, 3, 4 million. That means less money for everyone else. If the CEO is getting 2 or 3 million, person under him or her would be getting $1 million, million and a half. The next layer of corporate management, high hundreds of thousands. All of them are doing well, but much less money than what they're getting today.
Let me just get back to this question of why the directors and those who are overseeing these fund managers don't they have a material interest actually in making sure that the CEOs and that the fund managers actually get paid according to some kind of a rational standard? I mean, after all, this comes out of their profits in a certain sense. So why wouldn't they be keeping a closer eye on this?
Well, different issues with the fund managers. The problem is that there is very little oversight. It's all very mysterious. I mean, if I want to find out, I'm from Illinois, so that's the one I'm pick on. If I want to find out what did their advisors for the Illinois State Pension Fund get, it'd be very, very difficult for me. Most of that information is not publicly available, which, to my view, that's the first step in stopping it. Let's find out what we're paying them. And there really, to my view, is no excuse. These are public funds. So what's the excuse? And for college campuses, it'd be great, when they tell the students we have money for financial aid or we can't afford to pay our custodians more, we go, what are you paying your people running your endowment and losing you money, by the way? In the case of directors, again, it's a very perverse dynamic that in principle they are supposed to represent the shareholders. It's almost impossible for shareholders to remove directors, though. I joke about it's like the Soviet elections back in the Soviet Union. Everyone got 99+% of the vote. It's very similar with directors. If they're nominated by management for another term, over 99% of them win. So from the standpoint of director, it's a very cushy job. You're paid 2, 3, even 400,000 a year for maybe 100, 150 hours a year of work. Very cushy job. And there's no issue as long as you don't get people upset. So in principle, you're supposed to be there for the shareholders, and you're supposed to be looking at the CEO the way the CEO looks at their assembly line workers. Oh, can we pay you less? Can we get someone for less money? But they don't do that because that's going to jeopardize their position as a director. So to my view, you really have a problem of a broken corporate governance system. And as much as I don't in general worry about shareholders being taken, I do think in this case, it makes sense. Give shareholders more power, rein in CEO pay, because that has such a large impact on pay structures on down the line.
So is there anything that the public and or the government could do about this? And if so, what?
Well, in the case of making the fund managers' salaries to make that public, any state can do that, and some states have taken steps that way. But the state legislatures could just say, all your contracts are online. We get to see what you paid these people. We get to see what they did for their money, and if they did poorly, then you're going to have a price to pay. You as the people who hired them. In the case of CEOs, I mean, you have to think of how you could change the corporate structure. One of the things that governance structure, one of the proposals I've made is we currently have a say on pay votes. Every 3 years, shareholders get to vote. It's non-binding, but they get to vote up or down. Do they think the CEO's paid too much? Usually they vote, they're fine with it, but about 3% of the time they vote against it. If you told the directors that if the shareholders vote no, if they vote down the CEO pay package, you lose your pay, that would give the director serious grounds for thinking, for asking the question I was talking about, could we pay this person less? And I think that could set in the right dynamic where you'd start to see some of these big paychecks coming down.
Okay. Well, I was speaking to Dean Baker, senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thanks again, Dean, for having joined us today.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.